It's great to see so many old faces and old friends and not so old friends as well. Welcome indeed. So without further ado, I want to go straight into this and start really with the following. Meet the generations. Now, I know what you're doing. You're all trying to place yourself in one of these generations. I'm assuming there's no generation alpha here. If you start at the left-hand side, the builders, it's often called the silent generation. They got on with things rather quietly, and thankfully many are still with us. Sadly, I'm in the baby boomer generation, but my generation is the one that has done very well out of house price inflation and growth in the economy. And then you can go along the X, Y, and Z, the millennials, the generation Y, and then the generation Z, the post-millennials. But the poor chap at the end got sort of cut in half because I've now going to bring in generation alpha. Those kids today under the age of 12 around the world. Really a significant generation for lots of reasons that I'm going to share with you. But everything I say, you will know it already because we can see these children, these kids, as they go about playing in the streets and going to school, etc. But the question is, what is their future like? Or how will they adapt to a rapidly changing world in the years ahead? Let's just have a brief overview of the previous generation, Generation Z, as a background to Generation Alpha. Sometimes called the post-millennials, and in many ways, a generation that has had tough times. They were born just before the start of the millennium. I say tough time because they're often called the iPod generation, but not for the reason you're thinking. These are not happy points, by the way, but think of that generation and the environment they've had to grow up in. They very often feel insecure. And sadly, we do talk a lot about mental health these days, and this generation has suffered probably more than most. They're very pressurized, get a job, get out and work, etc. And they've probably got a job, they probably are working, but they're facing challenges like what we haven't seen for a very long time. Overtaxed for sure. This is the generation that, in that squeezed middle, the ones who are going to be paying tax for many, many years to come. And of course, these are the students that have taken on student debt. That generation has inherited the system of student fees and mortgages, by the way, that I could not have imagined when I was a young person. So the iPod generation is Generation Z. In summary, this generation tends to say, what did we do? Why is it our problem? Very sad, but that's the reality we face, or they face. But now we have Generation Alpha, born since 2010. I can make that even more exact. This generation is born since March 2010. And you should be asking me, why March 2010? Well, there is a particular reason for that, because that's the month and the year when the iPad was launched. So we said the iPod, the previous generation, and now we have the iPad. This generation is growing at roughly 2.5 million every week around the world. How anybody can ever prove these figures is very difficult to know. It'll be some years before we know exactly, but it is going to be a significant generation. We reckon that by 2025, there could be about 2 billion of this young alpha generation in existence. Of course, there's a margin of error, but the point being, it's going to be significant. That's the key point. And of course, if you think of where they are born, it's not primarily in the developed countries, it's in the emerging and developing world where they're born. So it's a very young generation with a very different outlook on life. Born into a digital world, and therefore we call them the iPad generation. It's the first generation that's born truly into a digital world. Previous generations, of course, they've adapted to digital, but this generation, on the day they were born, the iPad was there. So everything is sort of swipe the screen. I'm sure you've seen lots of pictures of children swiping the television and telling their mum the TV isn't working. What's wrong with this television? Of course, in the future, it'll be probably an eye recognition rather than a hand movement that will cause things to work. But Generation Alphas, and I have to admit, much of what I'm going to say is speculative. We cannot be certain. We're now going to explore this and speculate about how this generation will behave. But we do think they're going to be the most educated generation. And I can come back to this in a few moments. Education is going to be a #1 priority because for many millions of people, it's the way out of poverty, as we see in the world today. And also the most dynamic generation. This generation, like no generation before, will embrace technology in a way that has never been embraced before. And therefore, they will be prepared to change, I think, much faster than previous people. But again, all to be debated and to be, to be seen in the future. We won't know, of course, for some years. A very busy slide, but I'm not going to go around every single point. All this slide is trying to do is describe the world today, the world of Generation Alpha. And I'll just take a few of these just to highlight it. In the top left-hand part of the circle, I put technological connectivity. So just reflect on this. For the first time in history, I'll say that again, by the way, for the first time in history, almost everybody on the planet can talk to each other today. That has an impact on all of us. But of course, this young generation, the Alpha generation, will take this for granted. They're also in a world, of course, that's increasingly dominated by issues relating to sustainability and natural resources. Absolutely. And they will have a different view of this from previous generations. But they're also in a world that is facing rising income inequalities and global imbalances. The sad fact is the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. The income inequalities are widening, particularly during this pandemic, as all of the research is indicating. So this is a generation that will face tremendous challenges, which have always existed, but are now much bigger than before. They're also entering a world, of course, where we're all going through the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequences of that for the future. So we talk about, what will the new normals be? Well, for this generation, new normals will feel less new than for the older generations who'll be facing some shocks. I've also put on the right-hand side here, education. I've mentioned this earlier. Education like never before. The UN have estimated or forecast that between 2015 and 2025, the number of university students registered around the world will more than double, from 125 million to 262 million approximately. But the point I'm making here is we have never in the history of the world seen a doubling of this scale, of this magnitude ever before. And education is going to be at the very front of all developments across the world. And then, of course, above that, I've put AI and robots. So here's a generation, which is obviously not yet in the workforce, but as they enter the workforce in the next 5, 6, 7, 10 years and beyond, for them, artificial intelligence and robotics will become normal. They'll be used to seeing little robots delivering groceries around the streets. They'll be seeing drones in the air potentially. For them, robotics will be normal. For many of us, it can be challenging, particularly in the context of globalization. We now have a world where technology flows freely, capital flows freely, markets are globalized, companies are globalized, brands are globalized. But for this generation, this is the normal. So I won't go around all of these points, but you'll get details later. It's simply food for thought. If we could move the clock back 50 years or 40 years or 30 years, there'll be very different issues that I'd be discussing right now. So it's a really, I was going to say an exciting world, but in many ways, it's a frightening world that they're facing. But of course, for them, this is normal. And you may have some questions about this later, of course. So generations Y and Z, the two previous generations, it is predicted, or it is said, that they were the first to be less well off than their parents. Hence, what did we do, as it were? What have they done wrong? But it's simply unfortunate, to put it mildly. But Generation Alpha, now, I put this word deliberately here, will potentially be better off. Nobody knows what could happen in the future, but given what we know at the moment, there's every reason to expect that this generation will be in a very positive situation regarding prosperity for lots of reasons. First of all, they're born into smaller families. You know, I mentioned education earlier. Education around the world, I was going to say, helps to bring about smaller families. I may be expressing it wrongly, but you know, as people become more educated, they appreciate the consequences of larger families much more. And we're seeing that in many, many parts of the world. Smaller families, and of course, these children will not leave school at 14 or 15 or 16, maybe not even, well, they'll leave at 18 perhaps, but they'll probably stay on in education much longer, and they'll take longer to take on adult responsibilities. They'll probably stay in education, well, certainly through to degree level and even beyond that. I'll come back to that later once more. So interesting to think of the consequence of this. They will therefore join the workforce later, and that may have good implications or negative implications, but they will be more questioning about why do we need to work, you know, immediately after we leave school at whatever that age is. They're much more reflective, I believe. And I believe they'll have children later. We're already seeing signs of this, of course, in the previous generations, but I think this alpha generation will delay. And technology will make that much easier, of course, to delay having children. And many will live to over 100. Goodness me, the centenarians have arrived. Of course, they're here already, but many more people will live to over 100. And that will bring with it many, many challenges to do with health, pensions, and when will you stop work, and so on, and who will look after these people. But you know, this is inevitable unless, and I don't want to make a prediction about more pandemics, but unless something fundamental changes. If you look through history, this has been a trend. Now, the real purpose of this webinar today is to explore what we think the impact of Generation of Alpha will be, in particular implications for business, government, and of course society. Now, we only have a short time to raise some of these points, but of course I'm hoping that this will stimulate conversations later as well. So let me take a few of these. Let me focus on business first of all. I think this is as I said, an exciting time and also a challenging time. I think there is no doubt about it. The business world, as I've said on the slide, will be confronted with the most demanding customers in history. They've got information at their fingertips. Well, we all have that. But remember, you've got to think how you use it. For this new generation, it'll become the norm to be prepared to research what they buy in advance. And they may not even go to shops, by the way. I suspect it'll be click, click, click. The Amazon Prime phenomenon will be, of course, is normal now, but even more normal for them. Often describes a generation with a 10-second attention span. You've got to capture them very quickly. I've made a comment many times in recent years that, the old-fashioned form of marketing was that companies went out to find the customers. So we had mass mail shots, mass email lists. Well, I think that's outdated. Companies do not find customers. Customers find companies. And I think Generation Alpha are not going to look at marketing and respond to it. They're going to look for you and find you. But the question is, who will they want to find? I've often said that companies need to have a beacon. They need the world to see them and to be spotted in the crowd of competitors. A challenging thought, by the way. How do you make yourself noticed in a crowd? Well, Generation Alpha, they will find you, but you have to have reasons why they will find you. They will expect speed. So please don't tell me that the delivery will come next week. I want it today. They'll expect responsiveness when they ask a question, when they ask for a service. They will expect you to respond immediately. And of course, this horrible word, customization, we talk about mass customization as a standard. What that means is that individuals become a market segment of one. Now, as an example, and I'm a great fan of Amazon Prime, by the way, but I'm always amused when I buy something on Amazon Prime, and a few minutes later, I get an email saying, well, you bought this, why not buy this as well? they are marketing to me personally. That'll become a standard. And of course, an app style service for every business. It's hard to imagine in the future any business not having an app style service. Even the smallest cafe, the smallest market stall, you know, if you want to pay, it's going to be an app. It's going to be a touch payment system, and they will expect this. So cash for Generation Alpha will become, and probably is, a very strange commodity to use for payment purposes. As I say, it's happening right now, but look forward 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and visualize what will happen then. Big question for anybody in the HR business, anybody who employs anyone. How will employers motivate Generation Alphas? Now, as Lauren said earlier, here am I at Cranfield for the last 37 years. That's going to seem like, I will seem like a dinosaur. I'm quite sure of that to Generation Alpha people, because for them, the thought of a job beginning year 1 and ending in year 37 is going to be a very strange phenomenon. Work for this generation will be a series of projects. When you employ somebody in this generation, and even in previous generations, but increasingly in this generation, you've got to find a way to keep them motivated, to keep them interested. And that will be through a series of projects. And companies that fail to recognize this will lose the talent that they've got. And that talent will move elsewhere where they'll do another project and then another project. Well, why not keep them retained in your company, but make them feel that their job is a series of projects? In other words, there's no standing still. Say 37 years seems, will seem like a dream for those people in the future. And a word I want to stress here is the word complexity. If you go back to a previous slide, that circular slide, which showed all of those forces impacting on the generation, I think most of us here today will understand what complexity means in terms of, doing business, dealing with customers, dealing with IT, dealing with competition, dealing with information. It's incredibly complex. I mentioned that I'm a great fan of Amazon Prime. And the reason why I am a great fan is because they make a very complex purchase decision seem very simple. Click, click, click. It absolutely blows my head away every time. It is so simple. Well, for Generation Alpha, they will just love complexity. They will embrace it. For them, complexity will be the norm. They are already dealing with multiple inputs. I mean, I've got 2 screens. That's already complex for me. But for them, multiple screens, multiple inputs from digital sources will be perfectly normal. That they'll be playing games at one time, they'll be doing their homework at another time, they'll be with their friends on another device. For them, it's perfectly normal. And of course, they'll be in a world where projects are changing all the time, and they'll be searching out new projects all the time. And for me, to summarize this point, I believe that the most successful companies and the most successful individuals in the future will be those who are able to translate complexity into simplicity. Those who see complex problems as simple problems and who create that simplicity for the consumer, I think will be the most successful. Now, all companies, I'm sure, would love to do this, but you have to have the right talent that is able to do this. And that's why Generation Alpha, I think, has got a great future ahead, given that the emergence of artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., etc. I think Generation Alpha will demand more choices as customers as well as employees, by the way. But I think they're going to move in and out of employment and self-employment and education and leisure. So it will not be a linear progression. Leave school, leave university, work till you retire, and then you die. I think it's going to be much more dynamic than that. We're seeing signs of this already amongst previous generations, but remember what I said earlier, for Generation Alpha, this will become second nature. They won't even think about it. So working for a company for 6 months may seem rather unusual, and they'll look for another opportunity, moving into self-employment, perhaps stepping out for a year or 2, or of course, lifelong learning as they work and so on. And of course, leisure is very important to them. and certainly will be in the future. I believe they're going to be a much more entrepreneurial generation. The sense that they recognize the need to make a success based on their own skills and create their own opportunities. And I think that's a great thing, by the way. As I say, this is not just about, you know, advanced economies. I see this as a global phenomenon, and I think it's a good thing. I think what's also very good, I think they'll be much less focused on personal wealth and profits for the sake of profits. They will be questioning companies about their profits. Why are we making money? For what purpose? What is our aim? And I think they will seek to have an impact on society, and I welcome it. You know, if we think of the issues around the world today that I mentioned earlier, the environment, sustainability, imbalances, poverty, inequalities, I think this generation, like no other generation, will care and will want to have an impact on the well-being of others. I hope that's going to happen, but I think all the signs are positive for it to happen. And I believe they will have a much greater appreciation of the global environment and the challenges and issues that we face. You know, I wish this generation was already, you know, old enough to vote. I think they will be much more demanding of our politicians regarding the damage we are doing to the environment. And let's hope, of course, the meetings that will be held very soon will have an impact on this. But the scene is being set, I think, for a very demanding generation, and we should welcome this, I believe. Now, I'm in education, obviously, and clearly I think we need to talk about this as an aspect of the future for the Alpha generation. The huge challenge for all providers of education is how they're going to cope with this young generation. And I'm not only referring to university students. I'm going right back to nursery school education. You know, children right around the world who are who are embracing technology at a very, very young age. They will expect the computer to work. They will expect to have the internet in their classroom. They will expect to search out information and not be told what the so-called facts are. They will be explorers like we've never seen before. And I think it's a wonderful topic to talk about, but I will be very brief, I promise you. Now, when I was a lad a long time ago, you were given the syllabus. Education was of a broad nature. But I've often said recently, you know, if I was given a textbook, let's say in economics, and if I studied economics in the past, why do I want to read that textbook? Because I probably know much of it already, or I know some of it already. So why waste my time reading another textbook? You know, time is short. So alphas will not be looking for this broad education. Remember I said they'll be explorers. They'll be looking to train as specialists. And what I mean by that is when they research, when they discover, when they explore, they're going to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into specialist areas. The broad knowledge, they can get that at the click of a button. Go on Google, find the basic facts. But the specialist knowledge, then they'll spend time at that. And I think that this makes it even more exciting, by the way, for academics to teach this generation. They'll go far deeper into topics and niches right across all fields without exception. And I absolutely believe this, by the way. I think, you know, just as when I was growing up, A-levels were an entry to university. That was the big step. But now having a degree will be the norm. And then that'll be the entry to the master's level. And the master's level will become the norm. So I think this is what I mean by the specialist knowledge. Studying to master's level, I absolutely believe will be a rapidly growing sector of education right across the world. And I welcome it because I think we need to have a much more skilled specialist set of experts in the world today and in the future. So I'm looking forward to this. The big challenge, of course, is that education at all levels, as I said earlier, must adapt. This is not only for universities, this is right down to primary school and nursery school. You know, if you could travel around the world today, even in the poorest countries, and go into some of the primary schools, you will see a very, well, not everywhere, but I've got firsthand experience of this myself. You will see many examples of new developments taking place already. Obviously, if you go into the advanced economies and into nursery schools and primary schools, you already see a very different world where technology is embraced by all the children. So the big question is, and I want to finish on this before we open up the questions, to questions, is how will education at all levels adapt? How will that happen? Now, a bit embarrassing. I'm a baby boomer, so I chose this obviously as a summary of the world that I was educated in. I remember it so well. It was all chalk and talk, so verbal. You sat there, you listened, you took notes. Well, you wrote down with a pencil or a pen. The teacher was absolutely in charge, and quite right so. But it was that person out there, and me sitting here. Job security, and I remember this so well, was the number one priority. What job will I get after school? And that was the job then for the next 30, 40 years. It was very much do as you're told environment. And again, this is not a criticism, it's just the way it was. The curriculum was determined, at the center. You were told what it was, you had no choice. That's the curriculum. These are the exams. If you pass them, well done. Of course, closed book exams, totally normal, and everything was books and paper. I've said in recent years, I would abolish all closed book exams. This is so, it's like the Victorian era. Now, I'm not in the Victorian era, by the way, in my generation, but I think it really is very, very traditional and old fashioned. Now, the world today for children in primary school and just beginning secondary school, in other words, Generation Alpha, is very, very different. For them, everything's about seeing and touching, visual, experimentation. Try it and see it, and then try it again. The teacher is very much seen as facilitator, somebody trying to facilitate the learning, but not telling you what you must learn. Clearly, flexibility is number one, and almost a customized syllabus. I'm not being literal with that, but flexibility in the way people learn, and therefore flexibility in terms of career choices. Remember, I mentioned about employment, self-employment, leisure, etc. Now, this flexibility will be expected, will be the norm. Commanding in the classroom will become more about collaborating, team-based learning. Again, we do that a lot at Cranfield. We focus on collaboration, but this is going right back down the different levels. And of course, the learner becomes the center. It's a learner-centric environment. What does this person require most? So almost a personalized or customized learning environment. An open book world, open book and go and explore, as I said earlier. And of course, glass and devices, not books and paper. A very different world. As I say, I'm at the left-hand side, that's my background, but Generation Alpha at the right-hand side. And who knows what will happen after this, what the world will look like, after Generation Alpha. But on that note, I'm actually going to stop a little bit earlier because I want to answer as many questions as possible. And I look forward to Lauren raising those with me. Thank you so much indeed. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Joe. There are a lot of questions coming through, so we're going to open up for these now. So please continue to pop any questions in for Professor Nellis into the chat function on the right-hand side. To kick us off, the first message is from David Griffin, who asks about Gen Alpha. Will AI take on the adult responsibilities so they don't have to?
I think potentially, yes. I think AI will and is changing the world of the future. There's a related point to that I want to raise. So the answer is yes, in certain sectors, in certain businesses, AI will replace people. And many people are beginning to ask, well, what about jobs? What's going to happen to those people who will be displaced? That's a valid point to make. In all honesty, I am concerned. But the answer is then the generation has to be even more flexible and more adaptable. Let me not bore you too much, but if you go back 200 years and we talk about Kondratiev cycles. Kondratiev cycles mapped out the phases of technological development. But 200 years ago, those phases changed the world very slowly. But today, the ICT world is changing the world very quickly. So who's going to be the ones able to adapt? It's the ones who are most educated, most flexible. And I think that's going to be Generation Alpha. But it is a big question, and one that I don't dismiss lightly. I think for some people who are at the margin of these generations, they will be left behind, sadly. And my other point, just before I finish on this topic, if we could move the clock forward 20, 30, 40 years, what concerns me is this: who will own the robots? Who will own all of that artificial intelligence? Because the concentration of wealth potentially would be in the hands of fewer and fewer companies and fewer people. So I think we are facing a question about distribution of income. It's almost a Marxist question again, but it's a serious point. But of course, I'm exaggerating from today into the future. We've got a whole transition between those two time periods. Generation Alpha will be at the forefront of these issues. Thank you, Lauren.
And it's an interesting point, actually, because as you say, there's a gap between what could happen and what you're saying now. So it leads to a question from Emma Davis. Is about how accurate do you think your predictions for Generation Alpha are?
Oh, I wouldn't put any money on it whatsoever. Nobody knows. But as I say to my students in economics, we cannot forecast the future perfectly. But what option is there? We have to use our best judgment, our gut instinct, look at the evidence, and then plan our business accordingly. So absolutely, I would not ask anybody to bet their shirt on any of this, but you still have to make decisions about your business and plan for the future. And all I'm trying to give you is food for thought. Some of these points clearly I think are going to be wrong. I think some are going to be accurate, but by the time we know, I'll probably not be here anyways.
That's a sad thought.
I hope I will be here, but it's a basis for planning is my point.
Thank you. Another question is from G. Smith. You spoke about motivations for Generation Alpha as employees. Yes. How important will money be to Generation Alpha? And what is going to be their key or primary outlet for that money?
Yeah, a great question, by the way. As I just said, I don't know. But my opinion is, I think they'll be much less motivated by money. It links to the first question, actually. I think we are heading into a world where the topic of universal income, universal basic income is going to emerge. It's already becoming a topic in several countries, that the concentration of income, the concentration of wealth is creating problems for the world. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. I think for Generation Alpha, they will recognize this. And they'll recognize the need to narrow that disparity, the need to spread the wealth and the income much more equitably. I really hope that's the case. In Africa, there's a saying, a hungry man is an angry man. That's just a cliche. But, if you take that in its literal sense, if the gap between rich and poor continues to widen, we are building up a problem for the future. I'm hoping Generation Alpha will see this faster than previous generations, and therefore will be less motivated by the accumulation of money and much more concerned about the quality of life for people of the world. I hope so.
Thank you. A related question actually from Akash Deep is talking about that education aspect. He said more and more of the workforce will have technical certifications and skills doing decomposed tasks. Will it not make university education less relevant for a big part of the young workforce?
I think it's very possible. I noticed today in the British newspapers, Tony Blair was, speculating about the possibility of 2/3 of all students going to university. I'm not of that mindset. I think it's about the right training for the right job prospects. And I don't think university is the only option. But let me make this very clear, and I do want to stress this. Here am I sitting in the UK, very fortunate, where there is already a lot of people in universities. My point about education was not about the advanced economies. It's about the developing world. It's about the hundreds of millions of people who have not had the benefit that we've had of education at all levels. So I think it will be an explosion in education globally, an explosion in university education as well as secondary school, thankfully, but it will not be the only development. So I think apprenticeship skills development are absolutely essential. So it wasn't either or, I think it's actually both. But remember, as I said at the very beginning, education has been shown to be the way out of poverty for billions of people. But you have to define the word education. of course. It's not just about universities.
Thank you. And to that end, Rachel would like to know how will everything affect their school years? She says, sounds like they will feel very restricted until they leave school.
Oh, I think the opposite. Sorry, I didn't quite get that point. In my opinion, remember, I'm well past school age, but you know, if I had children of that age going into primary school and secondary school, I would expect them to have a world of choice, of flexibility, of, as I said, customized learning, almost to the point of individuals having learning tailored to their needs. So I don't see it as being restricted. I see it as the exact opposite to that. I think it'll become so open and flexible. And by the way, I really do see a role for online education as well as face-to-face. I don't think it's either or. One of my dreams, by the way, is to have a million people on this screen, and I'll be a hologram or an avatar. And that's what I want to visualize in the future. It will come. You go to airports, you see holograms there giving you instructions about your little security bags and so on. I think it's all going to come in the future. If you can imagine it, it will happen.
Thank you. We have a fascinating question from Andrew Hayworth, who's talking about the connectedness of the generation that you mentioned, but combined with the social media algorithms that we have. He says, will Gen A have a rounded enough worldview to manage politics effectively? The effect of social media at the moment is to funnel people into communications which only reinforce what they believe, perhaps erroneously.
Well, I totally agree with the point being made. Absolutely agree with that point. So I'm going to just express my wish and my hope. I hope Generation Alpha see through what is happening today. I hope they're going to be smarter than we have been. I won't mention Brexit. I won't mention the US election. I won't mention, but I really, really do hope that they can see through the impact of social media and how we can be changed in terms of our behavior. So I keep my fingers crossed that they're going to be smarter than we have been in recent decades. But thank you for the question. I totally agree with what you just said, by the way. The danger is, if Alpha generation is as stupid as we have been and are as easily duped as we've been, then all bets are off. Then it's going to be Big Brother. It's going to be big corporations. It's going to be the wealthy determining everybody's future. And I hope I'm wrong. I really do.
Oh, I hope so. I think in the grand scheme of things, social media is still all very new in the scheme of things.
But it can be abused. It is being abused. We're all being abused by it, and I hope we learn.
Javier Clark would like to know: can we, the older ones, his words, embrace the values and attributes of Generation Alpha as well?
Great question. Well, those who know me will know I'm an optimist first and foremost. So the answer is yes, we can. It may sound rather, silly, but surely we can learn from the next generation as much as they have learned from us. In many ways, I hope they don't learn from us and all the bad habits that we've developed. So wouldn't it be wonderful if in 10 years or 20 years time that politics and the media and social media and business are dominated by Generation Alphas who've learned how to adapt to this new world, that have got a greater conscience, that do care more about society, that aren't money oriented? Wouldn't it be a wonderful dream? So the answer is yes, I hope so. And surely all of us would agree that we will never stop learning, or we should never stop learning, even from the younger generation. That sounds like a sermon, by the way. I apologize, but it is great. It's wonderful to see kids today who show you how to behave. I'll give an example, although she's not Generation Alpha. Emma Raducanu, the tennis player. I mean, what a wonderful person. We can all learn from her behavior and how she's responded to her success in tennis. Wonderful. That's a bit of a plug, by the way, for British tennis.
Thank you. Zane Sequiera would like to know, would there be major differences between Generation Alpha from advanced economies and those from emerging and developing ones? Their view and interaction with the world would be contingent on the resources available to them.
That's a really important question you've raised, by the way, and it's one that I've faced in the past in a different context. Let me put it this way. Those of you who are from developing economies, and I'm very familiar with West Africa. I regard Ghana as my second home. And what is wonderful to see is how countries, for example, in West Africa, how they've been able to leapfrog technology, mobile phone technology, using MTN software from South Africa. In other words, it is possible, and we are seeing it, that developing countries can actually leapfrog technologies and avoid some of the mistakes that we've made. So in that sense, provided resources are made available, provided that they're given the opportunities, I absolutely believe that those children from developing countries and emerging markets will accelerate up the scale in terms of impact, global impact on business, on society, even more so than those from advanced economies. I hope I've made that point really clear. I've witnessed that myself. It's just wonderful to see countries that don't have the legacy that we have in advanced economies. They're able to ignore the legacy and go straight to perhaps some of the more exciting and more better opportunities than we've had in the past. So I'm optimistic, but as somebody just said, as you just said, it is subject to resources. And remember the point I made earlier, there is a problem here. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The gap is getting wider. And unless we tackle that problem, the growing imbalances and inequalities, the danger is that many countries will be left behind. Many millions of people will be left behind. And that does worry me. That's one of my biggest fears for the world, by the way.
John O actually has a question about that. He says, as wealth continues to concentrate in fewer hands and invariably becomes a power threat in the form of control of AI, how do we ensure this is not abused? Can AI assure neutrality in this context?
Well, John, I said I was an optimist. Now I'm going to be a pessimist. How can I put this in a way that doesn't sound too extreme? But when the gaps between the rich and the poor become so wide, history has shown us we end up with quote unquote revolutions. I use that word very cautiously, very, very carefully. But revolution doesn't necessarily military or uprisings. But I think there will be a revolution. I think companies that don't respond to the needs of society, that don't respond to the widening income gaps, companies that keep on taking a bigger share of incomes in the form of profits, I think the revolution will be a kick, a push back by customers, by individuals, by society. But this is what you've raised is a very difficult topic to be sure about. I'm trying to be optimistic here, but I think the last 10 years have shown that maybe I'm too optimistic. But I still live in hope that through this type of forum, we will all be much more aware of what's happening in the world. And as we all go out back to our businesses, we will think about the implication of more concentration of profits and wealth in the hands of fewer people. So if I have a wish list, I wish all governments could come together. I said I have a wish list and would deal with global taxation and the avoidance of global taxes. All of this. I won't miss any companies, by the way, but the way in which companies are able to avoid paying tax. If we could just stop that alone, we could do a lot of good for the world. I sound like an evangelist. I'm not. I'm trying to make us think about some of these issues.
Thank you. Moving away from the economic aspect for a moment, Martin Spiller would like to know, will Generation Alpha maintain their position as they grow up and get older, or will it be a case that they mature and become more like the baby boomers?
Very good, Martin. Well, that depends on the next generation. Well, by the way, the exam question was going to be, what's the generation after Generation Alpha? Now, you don't get any prize for that one. So, Martin, the answer is it very much depends on how Generation Alpha help their children to adapt to a changing world. I would hope that some of the values, some of the changes that we're going to see will spill down to the next generation after that. But of course, what you're implying is very possible. To what extent will they become as engrossed as we are in, as some of us are, in being self-centered and being focused on profits and wealth and incomes? I don't know is the answer, but it is something worth talking about. And I would hope education will be the solution or the answer to this question, that they will recognize the importance of that and will educate the next generation not to make the same mistakes.
Thank you. Bearing in mind we have a fair few alumni on here and some new incoming students, we have a question from Adin Kule from asking, going into the future, what role do you think a business degree, such as an MBA, will play? And what's your advice for new students?
A great question. Wow. I think a business degree and an MBA from a place like Cranfield will be absolutely essential, of course. But look, I think that the real answer to your question is the nature of the degree and how it changes over time. And I alluded to it briefly earlier when I referred to lifelong learning and of course, the blend between online and face-to-face. So, you know, a degree is going to change. Of course it is. It has to change. It should continuously change. My own book that we use at Cranfield, my ebook, I call it a living book because I check the links every year, make sure that they're up to date because things change. As soon as you write a textbook and you print it, it's out of date. You know, it's history. You got to keep on refreshing. And I think in that sense, therefore, you know, Generation Alpha, for them, a textbook will seem very, very old-fashioned. What the heck is this? You know, they will go and find information for themselves. It's a bit like saying, you know, go out and buy Encyclopedia Britannica. Don't waste your money, please. You know, it's history. Go out and find information. So I think education has to change, must change. And those institutions that don't change will be the dinosaurs of the future very, very quickly. They'll be out of business. And I think an MBA from a place like Cranfield, I think, you know, we're very much of this mindset that it has to be a real dynamic experience at all times, even during the year, by the way. I hope my marketing was good enough, Lauren, for that purpose.
Absolutely. Always go for an MBA, everyone. 2 questions now relating to personal attributes. So AJ asks, how do you see the challenges in terms of interpersonal skills and personal interaction in this digital native generation?
Gosh, that's really good. A very smart question, by the way. Yeah, because I know what you're alluding to. The danger is that kids, you know, they talk to a screen at all times and don't talk to people. But, you know, maybe that's the way of the world in the future. I personally have loved the online learning. That's just a personal view. And I've probably interacted with far more people online than I could ever have imagined face-to-face during the last 18 months. Now, I know it's not for everybody. I know that. But maybe we've got to get into the minds of the next generation and what for them will be normal. I'm sure this is true for you as well as for me. For me today, normal is looking at my phone every 5 seconds. That's become normal. I can't imagine, not in bed, by the way, not in bed, but I can't imagine life without it. And so for this next generation, I suspect for them, it will be their way of communicating will be different from our way of communicating. And as a result of that, they will communicate with far more people in the world. You know, every one of us will have our own networks online, you know, across the world. And for this generation, that will be so normal. So I'm trying not to see the negative aspect of this, but I understand the negative aspect. You know, they could become focused on a screen. But there is a positive aspect as well. The internationalization of communication, the internationalization of friendships, of networks, I think is to be celebrated. But let's be aware there are possible downsides. Remember what I'm saying. I am not suggesting to you for 1 minute that this is all positive. I do recognize there are challenges regarding this development of technology and the impact on the minds and well-being of our next generation. I totally see that, and we've got to be aware of it. Thank you for the question. I do understand that.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier Alpha's focus on projects and their attention span.
Yeah.
David Griffin asks, does that mean they're mentally incapable of deep work?
No, I don't think it means that at all, but I take the point. I think a project could require very, very deep work and very focused work. For example, I've got friends in Ghana who literally don't have any hours of work. They're in the IT business. For them, it's 24/7, and they take time off when they want time off. I suspect for Generation Alpha, they will understand the importance of leisure versus work. But I think for them, work will become a spectrum, and it will not be, you know, necessarily 9 to 5. It could be 9 to 10, tick and go off to the gym for an hour, and then 10 to 11, you know, go and do something else. So I don't think it's possible at the moment for us to visualize what the working day or working week will look like. but I think it'll be a spectrum of choices, is the point I was making. But I understand the point you're making, but it is possible that they could dip in to projects and become deeply immersed for a period of time and then take a break and go back to it again. I don't see that as being an impossibility at all. I understand the point, because when I was working, I would spend 10 hours a day writing a textbook, and but I'd get a headache. I'm not sure it was a good idea, by the way. So maybe this stop, start is the right way. Only time will tell as to which is the best, of course. We're probably all doing it right now online, by the way. Stop, start already.
Thank you. Moving away from the theoretical into the practical, we have a question from Noor, who calls herself a Gen XY mother, and she wants to know any tips on dealing with Gen Alpha.
Well, I mean, listen, look at my age, okay? I don't have any children in Gen Alpha, and I have no grandchildren either. So as I said at the beginning, I'm probably the last person who should talk about this. But all I'm putting here on the table are some food for thought. But I think in answer to your question, gosh, and I think we probably all recognize this, let them live, let them explore. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. I heard this recently. As a nursery school where my children went to nursery school, a child recently climbed up a branch and fell. Okay, when I was a kid, that was normal. Well, guess what happened next? The tree was cut down because of health and safety. Now, I think that was a mistake. I hope this next generation will be allowed to live. So my advice is, not to take risks, of course not, but let them at least have some space to grow up and to explore and to experiment and to research and to ask questions, and not always expect to have the right answer. Oh gosh, I sound like an old man now, but it's just my wish for that generation. There is a danger, and I've actually written about this many years ago in a different context. A paper I published many years ago was called, and you can look it up by the way, Rule-Based Regulation. I think the previous 20, 30, 40 years, we have seen rules and regulations get tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. I think the danger is we will stifle innovation. We will stifle creativity. We will stifle people. And that's not to say we should have no rules, but I think we need to recognize the need for some fresh air, some breathing space. I'm hoping the next generation will lead the way, but I have a feeling that politicians may not necessarily respond.
Thank you. A question now from John Cornwall, who wonders, could old-fashioned practical skills become more important and relevant in the future?
I'll bet you John is not Generation X. I'll bet you that, or Generation Y. I see you, John, anyway. I see you, by the way. Well, I think that's a question that could be asked of any generation, of course. There's always going to be room for old-fashioned behaviors and skills and so on. Yeah, interestingly, in answer to John's question, I can well imagine Generation Alpha enjoying the traditional skills of wood turning, traditional skills of, I was going to say fishing, but I don't fish, but I can, it's back to my earlier point about this flexibility and looking for projects that interest them, including hobbies. I think that I absolutely can visualize that taking place. That will place value on not just mass-produced products, but also the value of personal inputs into making products and personalized services. So the answer is, John, yes, I can see that, but I may never see it in my lifetime. Of course, it's going to depend very much on how this generation is allowed to develop. Thank you for that.
We're coming to our final few questions, and they're fairly hefty ones. Starlo would like to know, how will governments evolve to maintain power in the Alpha generation? Yeah,
that's back to an earlier question. I think if there are any politicians online, please close your ears. But in many countries of the world, that will get me off the hook. I think politicians exist for their own benefit and their own welfare. I'm being very controversial in saying that. It's not true of all politicians. And I think there is a danger, therefore, that the Alpha generation will not be able to seize power from traditional politicians. As I said earlier, when tensions build up, such as the income inequalities, such as the political divide between politicians and society, it leaves a vacuum, and the danger is that creates tension, and out of that will come a crisis. So, as I say, I'm an optimist, but in some ways, I'm feeling quite worried about the future, given all of those tensions that I mentioned earlier. But, you know, the only answer to this is that we allow Generation Alpha to flourish in education across the world, not just developed countries, to flourish, to become much more aware of what's going on in their world, and to allow them to make decisions on our behalf. Only time will tell. Only time will tell. But at the moment, I think there's cause for concern, big cause for concern. And if that isn't addressed, if politicians don't wake up and smell the coffee, then there's going to be a problem.
Thank you. And our final question, the last one we have time for, is from Axel, who asks, how do you see Generation Alpha addressing mental health issues? Will they be more intentional in making time for self-care?
You've answered your own question, rhetorical question. I very much hope they will make time. They will recognize the importance of mental well-being. It seems to me that we've only become aware of it in the last couple of years during this pandemic. Well, I'm sure that's not true, but I think, you know, we've now started this debate about the importance of mental health and mental well-being, and we should have done that years ago, but we're here now, and I hope, and I'm quite confident, that the next generation will not let that slip. They will be demanding time for themselves, time for the family, time for play, time for you know, education, reflection. Absolutely, the point you've raised, you've answered it very well, and I very much hope that that will be the case. It has to be the case. Otherwise, we're stacking up problems for the future.
Thank you so much, Professor Nellis. Unfortunately, we now have to conclude our Q&A and event today. So thank you so much, everyone, and Professor Nellis, for all your time. If you've enjoyed the session, we encourage you to pre-register for the next event in our series, The Changing World of Work, hosted by Professor Emma Parry, head of the Changing World of Work group and a globally recognized expert in human resource management. Please look for the invitation in your inbox over the next few days, or follow us on LinkedIn for regular updates. We have so many fantastic opportunities at Cranfield to work, study, research, and so much more. So if you have any questions or want to take a look yourself, please go to cranfield.ac.uk/SOM or contact us on live chat on the School of Management site. Thank you, and wherever you are in the world, we wish you a great day and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Nice to see you all online. Bye-bye.